You might think that good quality paints and good quality brushes are the most important thing when it comes to watercolor, but what if I told you that the type of paper you use is actually just as important, if not more important, than the paints and also the brushes? That is because the type of paper that you use can drastically affect your painting results, even if you are using good quality paints and good quality brushes. The three main things that you need to focus on when you're choosing paper is the paper type, texture, and thickness. All three of these things can drastically affect your painting results, so it's really important that you're choosing the right paper, and I hope today's video can help. I do also have some Skillshare classes over on Skillshare, and if you'd like to check out my Skillshare classes, the link is down below, and you can also claim a 3-month trial period on Skillshare as well. But if you're more interested in colouring, then my Patreon page might be for you. Over on Patreon, each month I create new printable colouring activities and colouring pages that you can download, print at home and colour in. So if that interests you more, then you can check out my Patreon and the link is in the description. But anyway, let's just jump right in with today's video. There are three main types of watercolour paper: watercolour blocks, pads and sheets. What you choose is your personal choice, but there are a few pros and cons for each type that I wanted to run through. A watercolour block is paper that has been glued on all four sides with a backing board, and they are the most convenient type of paper because you can paint straight onto the paper without taping, stretching or prepping the paper first. As the paper is glued down, it means that you have a flat surface to work on, and this will prevent the paper from buckling as you paint. You can also move the block around to paint from different angles, whereas you can't do this with a sheet that has been taped to a table. Once your painting has dried, you can remove the sheet from the block by using a palette knife to slide underneath the sheet to loosen it from the block. The paper will be very straight with minimal buckling because it dried flat on the block. A couple of downsides to blocks is that they are a lot more expensive than pads or sheets, and they are more suited to light washes. Also, you need to be careful when removing the paper from the block as you can tear the paper. Watercolour pads contain multiple sheets of paper that are bound together, normally with a spiral or gum strip. Watercolour pads are a cheaper alternative to blocks, and you can buy them in larger quantities, so if you're a beginner they will be more convenient. You can also paint on multiple sheets at once. The paper should be easy to remove from the pad, but you will need to tape down your paper before you start painting. You can use scotch tape, masking tape or washi tape to do this. Sometimes the paper won't dry as flat as block paper because it hasn't been stretched out as much and water will cause some buckling. However, it is the best all-round paper to use because you can buy quality paper at a good price. Watercolour sheets are available in imperial sizes measuring 30 inches by 22 inches, and they can also be sold in packs or individual sheets. They are the most economical option as you can get multiple uses just from one sheet of paper, and you can cut them to a size you want. The problem is because the sheets are produced on rollers, two sides normally have a clean cut, whereas the other two sides have a rougher texture. It can also be tricky cutting them down, especially with scissors or a craft knife, so it's best to cut them down with a paper cutter. Unlike with pads, you will need to tape down your paper to a surface before you start painting. Which type of paper you use is up to you, but the important thing to remember is the quality of each paper will be the same providing you're using the same brand of paper. The watercolour paper I am using is by Arches, and I have it listed in the description below, as well as a link to my free watercolour materials guide that you can download. Paper thickness or weight is one of the most important things to consider with watercolour because you need to use paper that is suitable for wet mediums and able to absorb a lot of water. If your paper isn't thick enough, you will get a lot of problems. I want to demonstrate the results you will get by using 3 different types of paper. The first is printer paper, second is £90 paper, and the third is paper that is £140. Painting on standard printer paper was something that 13-year-old Amy was guilty of, and it really was because I didn't know anything about paper thickness and weight and thought you could just paint on any paper. Painting on paper like this will result in the paper ripping, and there's no questions about this because it is too thin and it's not designed for wet mediums. You'll notice the paper will warp immediately and start flaking before tearing, so please don't ever use paper like this. You can get watercolour paper that is £90 in weight, and this is considered a thin watercolour paper. This paper would be suitable for very light washes, dry brush technique or sketching, but it shouldn't be used with heavy washes of water. That is because it's very thin, so it can't absorb heavy layers of water. If too much water is added, the paper will start to buckle, and this can form puddles, uneven surfaces, and be hard when framing your paintings. I'd recommend using paper that is at least £140 or 300 GSM. This is considered a medium weight and will be suitable for most paintings. You'll be able to create a variety of washes and use many layers of water because the paper is heavier and more absorbent. If you're painting on a very large scale, then I'd recommend an even heavier paper such as £300 or 640 GSM, as £300 paper can still have some buckling, especially if you're working on a large scale. A lot of mixed media paper is also unsuitable because it's thin and it doesn't have a nice texture for watercolour. It is best to stick to paper that is specifically designed for watercolour. There are three main textures of watercolour paper: hot pressed, cold pressed and rough, but I'm going to focus on the two most popular, which is hot pressed and cold pressed. Hot pressed paper has a smooth texture as it's pressed through hot steel cylinders and compressed. As it has a smooth texture, it's best used for soft watercolour effects and lighter washes, as it doesn't have enough tooth to handle more water and textures. I like using hot press watercolour paper most if I'm painting smooth textures such as botanical paintings. That is because flowers are very delicate and hot press paper best mimics this. It's easier to create soft, smooth and controlled washes of colour and retain details. There's less grooves on hot press paper, meaning it's easier to get fine lines and details. So this paper is really good if you do a lot of illustration work and you're using illustration pens and gel pens. This paper is also more suitable for calligraphy or lettering, as it keeps lines crisp, whereas cold press paper makes lines more jagged. Another benefit to hot press paper is it dries really quick because water doesn't settle into the grooves. However, a couple of downsides are it has less tooth, so you can't add too many layers of water, and it's not great for dry brush techniques and textured paintings. So I'd say this paper is more suited to certain styles of painting. Cold press paper is a rougher texture than hot press paper, and it's prepared through cold steel cylinders and compressed. Cold press paper is the most suitable paper for beginners because it's a better paper to use all around. It can take more water than hot pressed, and so it's great for layering and building colours. It's easier to create dry brush techniques on cold press paper because there is more tooth, and I like using this paper best if I'm creating textures such as trees, foliage and landscapes, as you get an authentic look. If you want to add even more texture in your paintings, then you could use a rough texture paper, which is more textured than cold press paper. It's easier to blend and mix colours together on cold press paper, but it's harder to create fine lines and details due to the grooves on the paper, and it's harder to use mixed media on this paper, such as sketching. Which type of paper you use is up to you, and you will find each type has pros and cons. I would say cold press paper is probably the best as it's the easiest to use, but you need to invest in good quality paper so that you get the best results with your watercolour. So that is it for today's video, and I really hope that you enjoyed looking at different paper types and focusing on the three core things, which again is texture, thickness and type of paper. And if you did find this video helpful, then please don't forget to subscribe to my channel because it really helps my channel out, and it also lets me know that you've enjoyed this video. I'll be back soon with a brand new video, but until then, keep creating.